Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time I would like to talk about how we just learned something very exciting about the future of Nintendo Switch 2 games. What we have learned, I believe, should have some pretty big implications for what we should expect from Nintendo published titles moving forward. So what is it exactly that we have learned? Well, what we have learned is that we have yet to see a single, from the ground up, Nintendo Switch 2 title. Not even one. At least no full-on ground-up new titles. We could maybe count something like Welcome Tour or Dragon Drive, but those are smaller scoped, budgeted titles. I can't even think of any third-party games. At first I thought maybe Duskbloods, but I looked into it and Duskbloods actually also started off as a Switch 1 title initially. But as for Nintendo's own published offerings, Kirby Air Riders may be a ground-up Switch 2 title, but they haven't shown any gameplay for that game. And as for every other Switch 2 Nintendo title that has been announced, not a single one was made with Switch 2 in mind from the beginning. Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment was first being developed with Switch 1 in mind, but midway through they switched over to Switch 2, which allowed them to improve on having more enemies and frame rate. Mario Kart World, the big Switch 2 launch title, was also initially in development for Switch 1, but they were very concerned about the frame rate and having a good fidelity while also wanting to include more details and mechanics, and so eventually they switched over to Switch 2. But initially, for the first few years, they were developing Mario Kart World with Switch 1 in mind. And with Donkey Kong Bonanza most recently, it was confirmed that the game began development on Nintendo Switch 1 by the producer Motogura. Now, it was talked about how they were working on voxel technology, which is facilitating these nearly entirely destructible environments in Donkey Kong Bonanza, but ultimately that technology was too complex for Switch 1, at least at the level they wanted to, so they transitioned over to Switch 2. And so up to this point, we have yet to see a single frame of gameplay for a Nintendo title made ground up for Switch 2. Maybe Kirby Air Riders has been made ground up for Switch 2, but we haven't seen any gameplay for that. All the other titles that are coming out this year are Switch 2 editions, like Kirby the Forgotten Land plus Star-Crossed World, like Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, like Pokemon Legends ZA. These are all enhanced for Switch 2, but there is no totally new title made for the ground up for Switch 2 that has been shown off yet. Now, that's not to say that games like Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza aren't impressive. These games were initially being developed for Switch 1, but Nintendo had to wait and transition over to Switch 2 because they had such ambitious ideas that they needed to wait for Switch 2 to fully realize these ideas. But still, these games were initially in development for Switch 1. And so what that suggests here is that moving forward, the next wave of titles we are going to see, there's a pretty good chance we are going to start to see some games made for Switch 2 in mind from the very beginning. And so the level of ambition and scope and the types of ideas and technology they want to utilize may be on an even more sophisticated level. And considering this brings me back to The Legend of Zelda. As you see here, I'm sharing some gameplay for the Switch 2 edition for Tears of the Kingdom. And just seeing Zelda, a 3D Zelda game, an open world 3D Zelda game, running at 60 frames per second, it's a great experience to see. It flows so well. But thinking more on Tears of the Kingdom, this game, many developers found it hard to believe that Nintendo was able to pull this off on Switch 1. This is a massive open world game that greatly expands upon what was accomplished with Breath of the Wild. It's not just the massive surface, but they introduced caves, more destruction, all these different sky islands, and then the depths below, all of which you can explore through seamlessly without any loading screens. And then they also threw an Ultra Hand and Fuse where you can combine so many different objects together. And then on top of that, you can engage with these enemy encampments with a whole bunch of enemies and explosions everywhere, while having a whole bunch of NPCs joining you in a fight. All of this was added on top of the already fairly sophisticated physics system that was in place in Breath of the Wild. The Zelda team being able to accomplish this on Switch 1 was an incredible feat, but it has me thinking about the development of Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, how they were also going for very ambitious ideas for Switch 1 tech and ultimately decided to move on to Switch 2. It speaks volumes for what the Zelda team was able to accomplish, but also I'm sure Nintendo figured they needed to put out some games for Switch 1, and they did. They put out a decent amount. But it's very interesting that we have learned that games like Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza began development on Switch 1 for some time before they transitioned over to Switch 2 development. Now, if you've gotten to this point and you find yourself enjoying my content, I'd like to point out that I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so your subscription would be appreciated. And so what is next here? What kinds of games can we come to expect from Nintendo that go beyond what we've seen so far? And you know, I'll say this. I think Mario Kart World quite clearly looks substantially better than anything we could have seen on Switch 1. And I think with Donkey Kong Bonanza, once you see it in person, it's sharp, there's a lot going on. When you factor in the destructible environments, it's impressive and definitely not possible on Switch 1 either. But you know, I've also been playing the enhanced version of Mario Odyssey on my Switch 2, and this is not a Switch 2 edition, just a free update. And I gotta say, it holds up pretty well. It looks fantastic. And having also played Donkey Kong Bonanza, the demo that Nintendo has at a few different select store locations, I'm not here trying to say that Mario Odyssey looks better than Donkey Kong Bonanza, but what I am arguing here is that Mario Odyssey holds up really well. And really, the only drastic difference between the two is the fact that Donkey Kong Bonanza has this continuous level of destruction, which is a huge difference that I understand is very demanding on the hardware. But Nvidia has reported that the Switch 2 is about 10 times more powerful than the Switch 1. That seems like a significant leap. And if you look at some fairly impressive third-party games on Switch 2, like Cyberpunk for example, I can see how some people might see a game like that and wonder, why can't Nintendo put together something like that as well? Now, looking at games like Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, vastly different art styles here, but ultimately what I'm getting at here is I think we're pretty much just scratching the surface for what's going to be accomplished on Nintendo Switch 2 from Nintendo. If the Zelda team could pull off Tears of the Kingdom on the Switch 1, what can they accomplish on Switch 2? I'm imagining something that's far more impressive than the Switch 2 edition of Tears of the Kingdom. I do think 60 FPS has become the standard. We've seen pretty much every Nintendo game run at 60 FPS, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Mario Kart World. Even Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, while initially the gameplay they showed was 30 FPS, we know that they are targeting 60 with the latest clip they showed during their creator's voice. It seems that the standard for all Nintendo published titles on Switch 2 is 60 frames per second. Perhaps later down the road we will see some games not run at 60, maybe if they are targeting other more impressive things for the hardware. But it's exciting to think about what could be done next. We haven't seen what Monolith Soft has been cooking up. We keep seeing development updates from them on how they're working on all their R&D and streamlining their process here and adding to their talent. They're really building something up here to do something special with whatever's next. And Monolith Soft was able to accomplish some pretty incredible things on the Wii U and Switch 1, even the Nintendo Wii with the original Xenoblade Chronicles release. They've been able to put together some experiences that people didn't think were quite reasonable to expect on Nintendo's hardware, but with Switch 2, the kind of loot we might see, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to look, but I know it's going to look amazing. And as we've been discussing lately, we have gotten more evidence from the Donkey Kong Bonanza interviews that it does seem like there are other people that could still have been working on 3D Mario all this time. In other words, EPD Production Group Number 8, or EPD Tokyo as some people know it, may have been working on 2 big games at a time, similar to the Animal Crossing Splatoon EPD group. But this 3D Mario game may have been made with Switch 2 in mind from the very beginning, and when we finally see it, it could truly blow us away. Or I go back to what the Zelda team is working on here. We've heard rumors that they are working on this long theorized Ocarina of Time remake, as I've talked about ad nauseum as well over the last couple of years. How good is that going to look? Is that going to be kind of like a proof of concept for the level of fidelity we could come to expect for a brand new 3D Zelda game, but probably expanded even more so given that it would be a totally new title? And just how good is Kirby Air Riders going to look? I imagine this game's on a smaller scope, but when you are focusing on something smaller scale, sometimes you can put something together that looks pretty spectacular. Think about fighting games in general, or just how good Smash Bros. Games looks, because, well, guess who's working on Kirby Air Riders? The creator of Kirby and Kirby Air Rider, Sakurai, who's also the creator of Smash Bros. I'm sure what we see from that is going to look pretty impressive. And at least that game is likely to be shown off very soon, because we do know it's coming out this year, and we have seen some advertisements going around suggesting that perhaps they might be kicking up the marketing for Kirby Air Riders because they're going to announce a release date and probably also show off some gameplay fairly soon as well. I assume in a July Nintendo Direct, but we'll see what actually happens. And so really what I'm getting at here is that my hype is building for that next Nintendo presentation where they show off more Nintendo titles. This next wave of titles might be games made totally from the ground up from the very beginning for Nintendo Switch 2, and that may mean they're on another level, and that's very exciting to think about. But what do you all think? What do you make of this recent revelation that not a single clip of gameplay we have seen from any Nintendo title on Switch 2 was made ground up for the console? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.